The remilitarization of the Rhineland was Hitler's first major step in future conquests that would reclaim what Germany had lost in the Great War, which also signaled the start of Nazi expansionism, which ultimately led to the start of the Second World War, up to the point where Germany officially declared war on Poland and thus initiated the war. Hitler made several land claims that, despite being in breach of the Versailles Treaty, nevertheless failed to prompt any reaction from the Allied forces that had dictated them in the first place, partially due to the fact that the conditions were perceived to be somewhat too harsh in the first place. The reclaiming of the Rhineland was the first in many to come, and although it ended peacefully without sparking a war, it certainly wasn't without any risks, always at the brink of triggering a response that would have ended the whole movement easily. But to better understand this process, we need to look back on the aftermath of the First World War, and mainly on the Treaty of Versailles, whose conditions played a huge role in triggering the events that saw the rise of National Socialism led by Adolf Hitler and his bold moves to regain the strength of the German nation. The aftermath of the First World War saw Europe fragmented. The victorious Allied powers were free to impose harsh post-war treaties and conditions on the defeated Central Powers. The German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated, and the once mighty German Empire, forged mainly by the efforts of one Otto von Bismarck half a century earlier, had now become the newly formed Weimar Republic, a shadow of its former self, with huge territorial losses. Schleswig, Lucerne, Upper Silesia, Danzig, Memel and Western Prussia were now lost. These lost territories delivered a huge impact both socially and economically. On the Western Front, Eupen-Malmedy was incorporated into the Belgian state in June 1925. On the French border, the long-disputed Alsace-Lorraine became French soil again. But to further the humiliation, more steps were needed to be taken by the victorious Allied forces. In order to secure their border with Germany, France demanded a buffer zone, solidified by the Versailles Treaty, between the two nations to prevent any possible future attacks from the former. For this purpose, the Rhineland, roughly a territory surrounding the central part of the Rhine River, was to be demilitarized from the German army. According to the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, later solidified by the 1925 Locarno Treaty, Germany was forbidden to maintain or construct any fortification, either on the left bank of the Rhine or on the right bank to the west of a line drawn 50 kilometers to the east of the Rhine. In other words, areas west to the Rhine River belonging to Germany were to be occupied by Allied forces, and a line stretching parallel to the river to the east at a distance of 50 kilometers inland was drawn, so as to be included in the demilitarized zone. Additionally, 4 bridgeheads, 4 major cities situated on strategic crossing points on the Rhine River, were to be controlled as well as their surrounding areas within a circle of a 30 kilometers radius. 3 of these bridgeheads were located in major cities such as Cologne, Koblenz, and Mainz. The 4th one in Kehl, although not being in the occupied zone, nevertheless had a vital importance for France in securing its border across the Alsace-Lorraine area. In order to control these territories, the Inter-Allied Rhineland High Commission was created. It consisted of 1 member each from Belgium, France, Great Britain, and the United States. Each of these states were given specific areas of the Rhineland to govern during the occupation, which was planned to last until 1935. The northern part was to be given to the Belgian army, stationed at Aachen. The British army was given control of Cologne and its surrounding area. Koblenz was to be occupied by American forces, while the French headquarters were to be located south-centered in Mainz. The occupation came into force on January 10, 1920. On the last weeks of November and early December 1918, Allied troops began entering the Rhineland following the armistice, signed on the 11th of November 1918, which ended the fighting in World War I. On the 10th of January 1920, a few months after its signing, the Treaty of Versailles came into force, and the occupation's governing was determined by the Articles 428 to 432 of the treaty and the Inter-Allied Rhineland High Commission, which divided the occupied regions among the 4 Allied states. These and future occupations yet to come combined with the huge war reparations demanded by the Allied powers, added immense pressure on the already faltering German economy, and with it unrest that helped fuel the National Socialist movement, aka the Nazis. Under the Versailles Treaty's conditions, the highly industrialized Saar Basin, including the Saar Coal District, was to be occupied and governed by the United Kingdom and France, under a League of Nations mandate for a period of 15 years, lasting between 1920 and 1935. With the capital located in Saarbrücken, the largest city in the area, it even had its own flag. During its later time under occupation, a significant number of political opponents of the National Socialist movement, which was gaining power in Germany, fled to this region, and even pressed for the region to remain further under the governance of the League of Nations. Another big blow came as a result of the occupation of the Ruhr. Despite being in the demilitarized region, the Ruhr area technically was not part of the occupied zone to begin with. But this changed after March 1920, when an attempt to overthrow the Weimar government in Berlin led to revolution in the Ruhr area that ended up with the area being taken over by the Ruhr Red Army. As a result, the Weimar Republic was forced to send in the Reichswehr, the official German army during the time, assisted by the Freikorps units, to enter the demilitarized area and quell the revolt. Order was restored by the beginning of April. Nevertheless, this breach of the Versailles Treaty was ground for more Allied invasions. Temporary occupations occurred in places like Frankfurt and Darmstadt. However, the true occupation came later on January 1923, after Germany failed to pay the extreme war reparations, which resulted in French and Belgian troops entering the entire Ruhr area, all the way to Dortmund, thus including it in the occupied zone. In response to this invasion, with the support of the German government, it was decided upon a policy of passive resistance and civil disobedience, which led to the standstill of factories and railroads in the Ruhr area, by German workers refusing to work, resulting in clashes with the occupying French forces. Protest posters could be seen, showing German workers refusing French orders. However, in order to be able to continue to pay the salaries of these now idle workers, the German government ended up printing large amounts of money. This, combined with the already huge economic losses as a result of the occupation, helped create a massive hyperinflation which altogether crashed the German economy, furthering support for the Nazis. One of the most unique and peculiar situations created by the occupation may have been the Free State of Bottleneck. As a result of the 30 kilometers radius drawn around the bridgeheads to extend the occupation zone across the Rhine River, a small gap of unoccupied land remained between the French zone and the American zone. Named Bottleneck for its unique shape caused by the circular occupation areas around the cities, this microstate was effectively cut off from the rest of Germany due to lack of connecting roads or any other form of transportation. The Free State of Bottleneck existed between 1919 and 1923. This quasi-state had its own capital in Lorch, a town of 17,000 people, issued its own passports, and even planned to establish an embassy in Berlin. It also printed its very own currency and stamps, as can be seen from this 1921 example overlaid on the map. The Bottleneck state was abolished on the 23rd of February 1923. Originally planned to last 15 years by the Versailles Treaty, the occupation ended up lasting much shorter. The earliest state to withdraw its occupying forces from the Rhineland was the United States. Although expected to remain in the occupied zone the whole 15 years until 1934, already by 1919, the number of troops was hugely reduced. Headquartered in Koblenz, the US flag was flying across the Rhine on the Ehrenbreitstein fortress. Originally intended for destruction, this impressive fortress was spared due to its historical significance and became the headquarters for the American forces. After more than 4 years of occupation, the American forces decided to withdraw, handing over their headquarters in Koblenz and the Ehrenbreitstein fortress to the French army in January 1923, as seen in this historic photograph from 1929 showing French soldiers at the fortress, overlooking Koblenz where the Mosel meets the Rhine River. By February, the Americans left the Rhineland completely, leaving the control of their territories to France. On September 3, 1924, the Inter-Allied Rhineland High Commission returned control of the Ruhr area back to Germany, and by August 25, 1925, all French and Belgian forces had left the area. The British Army withdrew from their Cologne-based northern area in January 1926. The evacuation of the American zone, which was controlled by the French, came in November 1929. The complete end of the occupation of the Rhineland came in the 30th of June 1930 with the withdrawal of the last Belgian and French forces from Germany. The last territory to be returned to German control was the Saar Basin with the approval of the League of Nations on the 17th of January 1935. Many of the opponents of the Nazi regime who had escaped to this area seeking refuge were later captured and imprisoned. One of Hitler's main aims as soon as he came to power in 1933 was to free Germany of the terms of the Versailles Treaty. The Reichswehr was already the cause of a breach by rearmament, increased size by conscription, and working towards building its air force. In preparation for future operations, Hitler established the Wehrmacht, the new official army of the Nazi Germany replacing the old Reichswehr, and its first destination was to be the Rhineland, and the code name of the operation, Winter Exercise. The goal of the operation was to remilitarize the Rhineland region by sending a relatively small force to liberate the cities along the way to the border and, in a way, test the waters and see if an international response will come, and if so, retreat immediately. The plans for remilitarization had been drafted by German Defense Minister Werner von Blumberg already by March 1933, and on 1936 Hitler made the decision to go ahead with the plan. Originally contemplated for 1937, Hitler instead decided to order the operation to take place early in 1936 in order to take advantage of the element of surprise and minimize the risk for retaliation. On the morning of the 7th of March 1936, 19 German battalions and a small number of aircraft were lined up on the edge of the demilitarized zone prepared to enter. Shortly after daybreak, the army started to move in. Dortmund, Essen, Frankfurt. One by one the cities inside the zone were reoccupied and militarized. By 11 a.m., the forces reached the Rhine River and started the crossing over by the bridges in Koblenz, Mainz and Kehl. 3 battalions crossed over to the west side, while the remaining forces remained on the east side. At this point, news of movement from French troops at the border reached the German command. Upon hearing this, Blumberg implored Hitler to retreat and abort the mission before an incident occurred. Hitler immediately inquired if in fact the French forces had crossed the border and entered Germany. After hearing that the French had not invaded and being encouraged by his foreign minister Baron Constantin von Neurath, who was much calmer and confident during the operation than Blumberg, Hitler decided to go ahead and continue with the operation. The first 48 hours of the operation would later be described by Hitler as the most nerve-wracking moment of his life. Yet, despite the odds, the mission was a success, and by the end of the day the operation was completed as German troops marched through previously occupied cities while being cheered on by their citizens welcoming them as liberators. However, this was a direct breach of the treaty, and France, Belgium and England had every cause to respond with overwhelming military force, a force that Germany in no way was capable of standing up to, and would most certainly flee from with its tail between its legs at the first sight. Yet, they remained silent. No action was taken. Hitler's ultimately risky gamble had paid off. The Allied nations stood by and watched as the monster taking shape in the form of Nazi Germany was flexing its muscles for the first time. The door leading to chaos had been knocked. Germany no longer was the defeated nation held hostage by treaties and reparations, but rather a loose beast freed from its chains, ready to wreak havoc on Europe and consequently on the rest of the world. The footsteps of chaos was heard for the first time as they echoed across the banks of the Rhine River.
The demilitarized zone begins. Men and guns pour in. For the first time in 17 years, the city's streets resound to the goose step. Young and old hail them, with never a thought as to the possible result of Hitler's bold stroke. Joy everywhere. How easily the horrors of war are forgotten in the ecstasy of the moment. Koblenz on the Rhine, once occupied by Uncle Sam's troops. Now Nazi sentries stand guard.